For those of you who are not aware, this is quite the moment for Spain in terms of the fact that the IMF has predicted that Spain will be the major advanced economy that's the fastest growing this year.
And that's the second
year in a row. Yeah, you beat me to it. And then as well as that, Spain was responsible for nearly 50% of the economic growth seen in the Eurozone. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, what could go wrong? There is a lot going on at the moment. So the first thing I wanted to ask you was, what are you doing to manage the possible impact of just this volatility that we're seeing at this moment in time?
That's a great question. I think it's good that we started by putting the figures down so that we know that Spain is actually the only major economy that had its forecast revised upwards yesterday by the WIO, by the IMF. And it's actually on the back of a very strong growth momentum. That's actually what we've seen in Spain for the past few years. As you said, we're outgrowing the euro area. We're 10% in terms of size, but we are contributing 50% to euro area growth. And of course, exposure to the US is maybe less significant than other euro area countries, 5% direct exposure of our exports, but still indirect effects are still there. And at a sectoral level, a few sectors are highly exposed to the US. So,
such as,
for example, pharma, such as cars as well, such as some in the agri sector, wine, olive oil, and others, steel as well. So in a sense, we know that we need to get ready for that. And coming back to your question, barely 12 hours after the press conference by President Trump on the setting up of the tariffs, of the general tariffs, we already had a response plan on the table to protect our firms and our workers. So basically getting a grab of all our financial instruments and our trade instruments to protect our companies.
And is there anything else that you're doing to get ready? I mean, that was the plan then, but this is a very dynamic situation. Yes. I mean, what else are you looking to do?
Well, now basically we're following up on a daily basis on to get a gauge of the impact. We need to know exactly what's going on and to what extent our firms are already having or feeling the impact of the tariffs that are in place. Let's not forget that there is a window of opportunity for negotiation with this 90 days period of pause for part of the tariffs. But to a great extent, there are tariffs already affecting our companies, plus the additional element of trade deviation that can also affect Europe and also Spain. So we are in a monitoring phase to see whether or not we need to actually upgrade our current response and the extent of the financial instruments and of the potential also specific direct subsidies to companies that are mostly affected.
And I mean, one thing that's been notable is the effect that it's had in terms of Europe cleaving together. That, you know, nations that maybe had taken different stances have come together as a bloc. I mean, what approach would you like to see European policymakers take in terms of their response?
Well, as you said it, I think this is one of the benefits of the current situation, that Europe is really rallying around a unified approach and response, because we know that as separate member states or countries, we have less strength when it comes to negotiate a fair and balanced trade deal with the US or other partners. So we need the strength of the scale of the force of the whole European Union, which is 450 million consumers. That's what we need, and therefore we need to rally behind the European Commission. The Commissioner was here before, so that basically they feel that they have the full support of member states, and they can negotiate, as I said, a fair deal.
And where does this leave the EU's relationship with other nations? I mean, China specifically. I mean, what happens there?
Well, there is an element here. If Europe wants to be a grown-up in the new world order that is actually being redefined as we speak, we need to, of course, engage with the main economic powers in the world, and we need to also try to extend the network of strategic allies. We're doing that, for example, with Mercosur, with Latin America. Hopefully, the deal between the EU and Mercosur will be ratified before the end of the year. That's a great step for Europe, and particularly for Spain, as you know, which is a bridge between the European Union and Latin America. But also, we're extending that network to other countries in Asia. And with respect to China, coming back to your question, we know that China China is a rival, is a competitor in many areas, but it has to be also a strategic ally to the extent possible. There is a huge deficit in terms of trade with respect to China. We need to open up that market. We need to also attract investments from China within, of course, the economic security agenda that we have in Europe, protecting our firms or companies, but we need to engage with Chinese authorities.
I want to follow up on something that you mentioned. There was a fleck of it there. You referred essentially to Spain being a kind of bridge. So you're looking very outward facing. One thing that I've noticed is that Spain, at a time when other advanced economies, the US and UK most notably, are talking about cutting development aid, development assistance, Spain has been quite vocal about a desire to do the opposite and say that there needs to be a way to shore this up. But do you have any innovative solutions, any ideas as to how to do this?
Well, we've been pushing actually for the last few years to try and find innovative solutions, for example, on ways to rechannel the special drawing rights. There is a huge pool there of money that can be used for development, that can be used for these global public goods. And we've been finding solutions within the IMF, for example, with the creation of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. We also last year found a bridge between the World Bank and the IMF to be able to, within that trust, actually fund projects that are World Bank projects, so that we can use Euro area SDRs that can only be channeled to the IMF for World Bank projects. So there are, of course, ways to look somehow out of the usual comfort zone to go ahead and fill the gap in terms of financing development. And we're still, we were the first country to pledge to rechannel 50% of our SDRs. And we will reach that 50% goal this year, this month actually, with an additional disbursement of $1.9 billion US dollars to the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust of the IMF. So basically, again, fighting these against poverty in the most vulnerable countries, especially in Africa.
Is this a new disbursement?
Yes.
Okay. And are you calling on other countries to do this? Because obviously Spain can't act in isolation.
Yes. Well, we've been doing this, extending this call to other countries for the past meetings, both the annual and the spring meetings last year. And we can even go further, actually. We're ready to further engage in rechanneling up to 60% of our special drawing rights, another extra 1 billion euros, but we need also to find the instruments to rechannel these for the best of purposes. And also, when you were thinking about, or you were asking about other initiatives, Spain this year in 2025 will be hosting the International Conference for Financing for Development in Sevilla, end of June, early July. And that's where we want also to basically make a call to everyone that this is not the time to go back on financing for development. To the contrary, actually, we're really far away from the development goals that we did set for ourselves for 2030.
But why? I mean, why do you see the need to do this? Because, I mean, fundamentally, ideologically, this is a different way of looking at things. And other countries are saying, look, we need to be inward-facing, and there isn't a need to do this. Where do you see the value in this?
Well, I think there are two elements. So this is part of the DNA of the current government in Spain, but it's very aligned with the citizenship. I think this element of actually going ahead with this multilateral view, with this element of financing for development, that comes, or that is very entrenched in the Spanish society. And then there are additional elements, of course, related to the specific security concerns. For example, when it comes to Africa, there is the element of migration and the different routes that come from the particularly West Africa.
You mean via the Canary Islands?
Exactly. So there is a specific effort there coming from Spain to foster development in those countries to avoid that particularly the youngsters have to take the hard route to come to Europe.
So, I mean, to be clear, I'm the managing editor for Semafor Africa, so I'm particularly interested in the Africa perspective here. I mean, what initiatives are you talking about when you say, yes, we're going to do this in Africa?
So
any specifics you can point to?
So, for example, for Sevilla, let me just be quick and give you 3 examples on how we plan to go ahead. For Sevilla, what we want is, aside, of course, from having the statements and declarations, which are important because that gives a political signal and willingness, we want concrete deliverables. So one of them will be what we call debt pause alliance. So basically, not only public creditors, but also private creditors engaging or committing to include these debt pause clauses in the loans that they sign with vulnerable countries, so that when there is a specific event, such as a famine, such as a health crisis, or a climate event, then they can pause the interest payments, and then they can devote those revenues to actually get out of those crises without turning this liquidity issue into a solvency problem. That's one particular element that we'll be pushing for, to include more countries, to push also the private sector to go ahead with these clauses going forward in their loan contracts. And there's another one which is related to the debt swaps. We're working together with the World Bank to have a debt swap hub, basically where all the current experiences in terms of debt swaps for vulnerable countries can be put together, best practices, also capacity development, technical assistance there, so that we can get into more countries, both debtor and creditors, engaging also with the private sector into these particularly important instruments and fiscal space freeing solutions. And then the third element is one that we started with Senegal, which is what we call Forward Alliance for Africa. So basically what we want is to further develop or create economic development, as I said, in the countries that are the origin of these big migration flows for Europe and for Spain particularly.
So that's Senegal, and where else? Gambia?
Senegal, which is the first pilot case, and then Mauritania as well, Gambia. So there are a few countries that will be part of the initiative, but we are trying to launch the first pilot with Senegal, basically aligning their interests, their own agenda. They have their 2050 agenda, and aligning that with the main stakeholders that will be investing, not only private sector, but multilaterals as well, and somehow trying to put all the necessary layers for economic development at home.
And are these Spanish companies that would be involved?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes. So there is the element of the private sector actually kicking in and getting into those specific projects. And there are, for example, there's one project related to the creation of a high-speed network of connectivity via Spanish satellite company, Hispasat, that will prove actually essential, for example, for telemedicine or for long-distance education, which are elements that are particularly important in a country that somehow is also scattered throughout the whole geography.
And the last question that I just quickly want to ask.
Sorry, I'm very long in
this. No, I do want to get to this. There's the consideration of 100% tax for non-EU people purchasing property in Spain. What's the thinking behind that, in a nutshell?
Well, the thinking is that not only in Spain, but also in other Euro or EU countries, there is a big challenge with respect to access to housing, and particularly affordable housing, and particularly for youngsters. So what we saw is that in some specific areas, the impact of purchases from non-euro area residents actually was having a toll in terms of increase in prices. And in areas, for example, in the southern coast, in some cities like Marbella, for example, the non-euro area residents were affecting up to 8 to 10% of total transactions on a yearly basis. So this was having an actual impact.
So making it unaffordable for
exactly.
Locals. So is this something that the government plans to go ahead with?
Yes, of course, we are planning to go ahead with it, because now it's a time to really reduce those constraints, and what we hope is that once everything will be settled and will be set up again, and there will be an increase in supply, which is another area where we're working on, then we can release these restrictions, these constraints. But up to now, there is somehow the greater good which is providing for affordable housing for Spaniards.
Excellent. Carlos, I'd love to talk all day, but we're pushed for time, so I'll have to end it there. Thank you so much for your time, and please thank me. Join me in thanking him.